Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Before we get started today, I have something very important to talk about, and that is the COVID-19 vaccine. COVID-19 vaccines have been safely administered to hundreds of millions of Americans, including myself. COVID-19 vaccination greatly reduces the risk of severe illness, hospitalization, and even death. The nation's top medical and healthcare experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are our strongest tool to help stop the pandemic. So learn more at vaccinate.wv.gov or call 1-833-793-0965. Again, that's 1-833-793-0965. And please, get vaccinated. All right, well, the end of summer is looming near, and it is a great time of year for lots of fairs and festivals, but it's also a great time of year to try to get a handle on Japanese knotweed or Bohemian knotweed or giant knotweed or any of the knotweeds that are plaguing us in this area.
Yeah, and it's funny that they call it knotweed when it's very much a weed, right, Karen?
Yes,
now this is Japanese knotweed, Knotweed.
Right.
So once you get it, you're with it forever, like tying the knot. So it's knotweed.
And so it's also the Japanese knotweed is Falopia japonica. It was introduced to the States in the 1800s, and it was brought in as animal fodder and for an ornamental purpose. And it really started to escape when people started dumping their lawn clippings and their compost into natural areas. And the rhizomes of this plant are very, very resilient, and it is the main way that the plant spreads. We're starting to see a lot of issues now with people who are having construction or repair done to their banks or their yards, and the fill dirt that companies are bringing in are often filled with knotweed rhizomes. And so we're starting to have more and more problems of knotweed popping up in people's yards, and it's also causing some significant damage to our stream banks.
Yeah, and that's exactly where you see it a lot. It's a very large plant that it fills up everything. It has these very large leaves on it that they're heart-shaped leaves, and these long hollow stems. So they almost look like bamboo. The leaves don't look like bamboo, but if you see a lot of large hollow trunks, you think bamboo. I mean, and it's funny, but they're completely different plants. One's a monocot, one's a dicot. So when we talk about things that you can do to kill these things, it makes a big difference in whether you're trying to fight bamboo or whether you're trying to fight knotweed.
In addition to having those heart-shaped leaves, they also have this bright carrot-colored root system. You have a giant, thick, brittle rhizome, so it snaps very easily. And unfortunately, when we're trying to dig this out, we can get that main trunk of the rhizome. It usually goes down about a foot, sometimes more, and sometimes we'll break it. And leaving that broken piece, unfortunately, means we're just going to get a whole new plant. And so digging it out can actually cause a few more problems than expected, because each and every little piece of the broken rhizome that you leave behind can start a whole new plant. And that's actually one of the ways that this plant likes to propagate. Is it breaks its rhizomes off and floats them downstream to a new place. And some new research is starting to show that part of how knotweed reproduces is by causing brittle stream banks. And so by weakening the structural integrity of a stream bank, it can help itself propagate more rapidly and more broadly. So what we're starting to see is that even though these stream banks have vegetative cover on them, they're not staying put like we would expect a stream bank that has vegetative cover on it to stay. And so we've done some programs on stream bank control, but what we're starting to learn with knotweed is we need to control the knotweed in order to better stabilize our stream banks. And while it is very difficult and time consuming and labor intensive, it's a lot cheaper and longer lasting than putting in some construction devices that restore that stream bank. So putting in those rock cages or even paving the side of a stream bank. We don't want to do any of that because we need to maintain our healthy stream banks and allow them to move and shift as nature wants them to. But as we're seeing these big, heavy rainstorms that are more frequent, give us more water, we need to do everything we can to protect the integrity of our stream banks, or what we're going to have happen is they're just going to kind of fall into the river. And that means less land for you to graze, less land for you to grow crops on, and less land for our buildings to stand on. And so if we don't want to watch our cities and our towns start falling into riverbanks, we really need to start taking action against this knotweed. But at the same time, we need to take the right action because research has also shown that if you just go in with a weed whacker and cut it down, well, you'll control it a little bit, but what happens is those rhizomes keep creeping out further and further to the side, and you can actually make the problem a little bit worse. And so what we're going to talk about here today is how to control it the right way so that you can have some long-term results. Now, it's not going to be a forever result because we're never getting rid of this plant, but being able to target your activity in a way that gives you a positive outcome in an area where you can have a greater impact. So areas around high erosion sites or near a home, near an important pasture field, or near some just native plants that you want to try to protect. So what we want to do is give you the tools that you need to be able to attack this plant properly and get some long-term results.
Yeah, and Karen, one of the things that you mentioned briefly is rhizomes, right? Rhizomes are those horizontal roots that give rise to other plants.
I like that. Rhizomes will rise.
They they do rise after they move sideways. But some of the worst weeds we have are rhizome based. If you think about thistle's a beast too. And thistle's one of those things that if you are cultivating a field, like if you are tilling a field to plant into it, whether you're doing fruits and vegetables, whether you're doing row crops, as soon as you get thistle is one of those things that you till through that soil and you just start tearing those rhizomes apart. And next thing you know, your large problem with thistle just got enormous. It's the same kind of deal with this Japanese knotweed that you're saying. These rhizomes are designed to break, move, and regrow. And then once they regrow, they make energy. That energy goes back down to the rhizomes and empowers them further. Another plant with the rhizomes is the tree of heaven, Ailanthus. Ailanthus has very strong rhizomes. It moves laterally. And but what's that old saying, Karen? If you cut down one Ailanthus tree, you end up with, what is it, like 10
100
of their offsprings comes to the funeral, right?
Yeah.
and it just keeps moving that way. So with rhizomes, typically mechanical control is very difficult. And it, just like Karen was saying, if you start digging in there, that soil gets moved. That if you dig a hole, soil moves down, soil moves to the side. If it rains, it starts washing things everywhere. You have to shovel it somewhere else and stuff gets spilled. It's not hard for that stuff to get moved around and become a bigger problem than what you started with. So it's very important to make sure you get a good plan and that you are careful with how you're doing things. A lot of times, I'm going to say that dealing with rhizomous type weeds, you need not only a mechanical control, but also a chemical control. And just to look at some of the stages as in seasonality of something like Japanese knotweed. If we start in February to April is a pre-emergent stage of Japanese knotweed. And that's when the rhizomes are dormant and they become active as air and soil temperatures begin to rise in the spring. So you got this dormant stage in there. But that just means that if it gets moved, it'll reactivate as things get warmer anyway. So there's not necessarily a good time to start moving stuff. But come May to June, the rhizome, it becomes an active source supporting development of Japanese knotweed canopy. So May through June, the plant starts growing. The energy starts being allocated into that system. And then June, July, it takes off. And come August and November timeframe, that's when you start seeing the flowering. A lot of times that energy it no longer moves down to the rhizomes or up from the rhizomes in the early stages, but it's starting to get redirected into the flowers and the fruits. And once that stage is passed, then it gets redirected back to the rhizomes. So even when you're talking about chemical control, you have to make sure that you are able to apply that chemical at a time when it can move to where you want it to move. In this case, to kill the plant, if that's your desire.
Right. What we recommend is doing a cut when the rhizomes have reached their most depleted state in June or early July. Cut the plant, and then you're going to force that plant to re-sprout all of that growth. And then you're going to let it grow so that it keeps pulling out of those root reserves from the rhizomes and just depletes them little by little. And after that, then everything's turned around. It's trying to get ready for the winter time so it has enough food to survive the winter. And that's when it's pulling the most herbicide or most stuff down into its root system. So when you are looking at when to spray it, you want to go to a time where the plant is large and actively growing or actively storing nutrients. So the end of July, August, or a little bit later. You don't want to go too late because you don't want it to go on and set seed, and then those seeds can just float downstream. But you also don't want to apply an herbicide using a sprayer when the plant's in full bloom, because bees absolutely love knotweed, and knotweed honey is actually very tasty. So if you can find some, I encourage you to try it. But you don't want to spray when the plant is in flower.
Yeah, Karen. So we're talking about typically when we want to kill a plant, we're applying an herbicide. And most of the recommended herbicides are an aquatic type glyphosate, which is because the plant's typically found in stream banks, but also something like an imazapyr that is also a systemic, but has less of a drift effect that you would find with the 2,4-D or triclopyr. One of the things that you have to understand about plants is it does like to change what the direction that it flows its energies from. Most of these herbicides are actually absorbed by the leaves, and the leaves are also where sugar gets made. So if you're trying to kill a root system and that plant's not actively dumping stuff in the root system, chances are that herbicide's not going to get its full effectiveness. Also, if you were to spray something as a foliar spray, they can't break into bark. There are bark sprays that you can do, but typically the chemistry is a little bit different because that bark won't absorb things like leaf wood, for instance. But you have to make sure that you are applying something and that it will get moved in the right way to the right place for effectiveness. One of the things you did talk about was flowering. When a plant's typically flowering and fruiting, more specifically fruiting, it's mainly redirecting a lot of the sugars to the fruit itself. Spraying it in that flower fruit transition time really won't kill the roots very well. And obviously, if you're spraying something like an insecticide, that's instantly going to kill the bees or other pollinators at that. But something like an herbicide, you just want to make sure you're following the label. But if you just think about the way that the mechanism and the energy flow within the plant, that plant physiology, you are better off doing it after it's already set fruit, and it's basically redirecting those nutrients back into the roots so that it can survive the winter. And like we were saying before, just those rhizomes, that's where you want to target. It's a very hardy plant, so one spray is not going to cut it. Even though Japanese knotweed and bamboo are completely different things, they do have a lot of things in common, like one spray won't cut it, and mowing by itself won't cut it either. So that's one thing you can do, what Karen was suggesting, cutting it down, letting it regrow. But when you're doing that, you have to make sure that you have left enough leaf mass for the plant to absorb that chemical and for it to go down and then kill the root system.
Right. Yeah. So what we're recommending is that you cut in early June, and that gives it a full 2 months to grow back before you go in and treat it again or treat it with an herbicide. So Japanese knotweed will grow very quickly, and you'll find that come August, they'll be back up over your head. So you have a good canopy of leaf coverage.
Yeah. With most herbicide usage, you have to kind of balance. When the plant's too mature or too big, killing it with an herbicide becomes very difficult, and you really want to watch out with things like herbicides that are extremely movable in the water, something that has a label that you cannot use close to a water source. Then you just can't use that with something like Japanese knotweed, because it's going to grow pretty much right in the banks, right next to the stream, right next to the river, and you'll see it everywhere. So you want to make sure two things. One, you're using an herbicide that'll work. And then two, you're using something that's more water friendly and that doesn't have a whole lot of lateral movement in the water so that it doesn't off target kill something. And that's one of the reasons why they were recommending not using something like Triclopyr and 2,4-D, because they are broadleaf herbicides, but they move so quickly, and the drift instance of these two herbicides is very high. And because they grow in a stream bank, you are risking a non-target kill, such as a tree, a shrub, and those two things are very important for stream bank stabilization. So if you are using something to kill this Japanese knotweed, you want to make sure that you have a product that is labeled for water use / using close to water, and it doesn't have too much of a drift potential. So glyphosate and imazapyr are what they recommend.
Yeah, and you can use some formulations of 2,4-D near water, but again, you have to read the label. You have to make sure that you're spraying in proper wind conditions. If it's a really windy day, you should not be spraying near water. I don't care what you're using, because you do want to reduce any potential for drift. Also, spraying early in the morning can be helpful for reducing that drift. Now, if you are in an area where you have a lot of high value plants, let's say that you're in a wildlife reserve and you're going to be treating knotweed in and among a lot of native plant species, you don't want to have any drift. What you can do is you can use a system that's called injection, where you're actually injecting the herbicide directly into the stem of the knotweed. And if you're using an injection system, it's important to remember that you need to get it low in the stem. You need to be like the first or second node is where you want to do the injection. And the node is that little stretched out place in between the two lumps where leaves are attached. So you want to get in the bottom first or second node toward the bottom of the plant if you're going to do an injection system. Because what they found is if you inject higher than that, the top of the plant will die before the chemical can actually make its way down into the root system. So if you don't treat low, then you're not really treating at all. Now, again, you need to follow the label for any type of application, whether you're doing a foliar spray or an injection, or I don't even know if they've done research on like a basil bark application like we would do with multiflora rose or autumn olive. I'm going to have to look into that one. But anything you're using, make sure you're following the label. And like Dan was saying, make sure you have something that is appropriate for use near water if you are near a water source. And this is especially important if you're going to be near a inlet of a drinking source for a population. So if you're on the Ohio River, that's pretty much an inlet for drinking water, believe it or not. But you have to make sure you're using the right one. And part of what that is it's the additives that are used to spread or make the chemical stick. So if you're using glyphosate or Roundup in a inland area treating knotweed where you don't have water nearby, then adding a little bit of methylated seed oil or MSO can help make it infiltrate the leaves more effectively. And so if you're away from water, we do recommend that. But if you're near water, we don't, because that actually is going to help keep it floating and not breaking down in the water. So it will break down in the soil, but once it hits the water, it's going to float until it finds soil, and it's probably going to brush up against a couple plants along the way. And it is a non-selective herbicide, so it is going to affect any greenery it touches. Now, if you're looking at 2,4-D amine, that is selective, so it will not kill grass. So if you're looking to get rid of it in your lawn, that's more what I would try to use instead of a glyphosate treatment.
Yeah, that's true, Karen. 2,4-D will not kill the monocots, but again, you have a higher potential for drift. You can't always do things the ideal way, we'll say, but you can always do things the legal and safe way. So, you know what I mean? Like I said, triclopyr and 2,4-D have a high potential for drift. Typically, we do find a lot of trees and a lot of shrubs and things like that around stream banks. So it is just something you want to be cautious of. And different chemicals have different efficacies in killing something. It doesn't really correlate necessarily with toxicity to us or other animals or other insects. But you do have to understand the chemical you're using, what are the safety requirements, and is it going to be something that I might have to use more than once or twice, sometimes more than 3 times, but there's also limits on how often you can use something. And if you have questions on, what's the best thing I can spray for whatever, first question is, what do you use the land for? Or why is this a problem? Those questions will then lead you to, okay, these are the products that have certain restrictions that you might be able to live with. Here's what they are. Can you comply with these? And that's what it becomes. What risks are you willing to take? And are you aware of the potential side effects that you could see? The best thing is a combination between a mechanical treatment, biological, and chemical. The more approaches you take to something, the more chances of success you're going to have with it. But a lot of rhizome type weeds, mechanical treatment by itself is just not feasible.
Right. And we do have knotweed on organic farms as well. And there is an organic alternative to treating Japanese knotweed or whatever knotweed you have, but it's going to be more time consuming, and and you smother it basically. You're going to cut the knotweed stems and you're going to pile them up and put down 3 to 4 inches of bark mulch or wood chips. And then you're going to cover that with a 7 mil black plastic or non-woven geotextile material, because if it's woven, it's going to get light and oxygen, and you don't want that. So it has to be like a plastic or something that's not going to breathe. And then you're going to add on top of that another 3 to 4 inches of bark or mulch or wood chips. And you're going to let that sit for 3 to 5 years. Okay, that's how long it's going to take to nullify the ability of these plants to reproduce. And oftentimes what you're going to find is where you've treated it, they're just going to pop up a little ways down the road. And they're going to just spread those rhizomes out to the side until they get into a better area for them to grow. And so smothering is effective. And if you are an organic farmer and you're facing problems with knotweed, this is pretty much your only option. The key here is whatever you're doing, if you are cutting it, you have got to deal with the waste product so that it doesn't become more of a problem. So burn it or tie it up in a big old plastic construction bag and let it sit in the sun for a couple of days just to bake it. And that is going to kill it so that it can't reproduce somewhere else, because those stems you're cutting down will be able to create new plants too. Each of those nodes can put roots on it and create a whole new plant. So we want to make sure that whatever you're cutting, you're dealing with appropriately, and that you're not just moving your problem from one location to another.
Yeah. And a lot of times in research, something that we do that's not really feasible for the farmer is just if you remove topsoil, you can steam it, and that just basically kills all the seeds and all the rhizomes that are left in it, so that you can reuse it. And it becomes so tricky, Karen, like everything you were saying about smothering it, because I don't know exactly how long it would take to kill rhizomes, but these things are designed to go dormant to then resprout. Mm-hmm. And then kind of come back and then build itself back up. So for the organic farmer, dealing with something like Japanese knotweed, or even thistle, something like a thistle problem in an organic farm is very difficult to handle. Tilling is just a very hard thing to do. And the more you do it, the more it spreads, which is exactly the same mechanism that we're talking about now with Japanese knotweed. Smothering it is your only option, Karen. I fully agree with that, but it becomes a very hard challenge. When you're faced with something like that, you really have to figure out how to contain it.
Yeah, and the sooner you start acting, the more likely you're going to be able to control it. So you see one stem, you start digging around it and find out where it came from and how it's growing and get rid of it. It's not something you want to allow to get started, and you definitely do not want to till any area where knotweed is growing. It's just going to exacerbate your problem. All right. Well, as much as we are still enjoying talking about this subject, we are out of time, and we got to let you go for today. So we'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.